Shabbat Shalom. How many of you have ever taken a leap of faith? Maybe you pursued a dream profession even though it wasn't the most practical. Maybe you left a stable job to open your own business. Maybe you jumped into a relationship head first. Each of these actions take an amount of faith that things will simply work out. We may not know how or when, but in order to pursue something that is otherwise considered risky, we respond to a feeling that something will turn out okay. That feeling is often referred to as faith. In a religious sense, faith is believing that there is a God or a higher power that is helping to move the world along. Biblically, having faith meant believing that God was going to create a specific outcome. When Abraham decides to follow God on a journey away from everything he knew, he was showing faith. When Joseph was able to keep his spirits up, even after unfairly being thrown into Pharaoh's prison, he demonstrated faith. Time and time again, our earliest ancestors demonstrated their faith in God. But after having been enslaved for 400 years, the Israelites had lost their ability to hold on to faith. This week, we read Parashat Shelach Lecha. As we near the promised land, God instructs Moses to send 12 men, one from each tribe, to scout out the land. Moses does this, and the men return 40 days later, carrying one of the massive grape clusters that they found. So massive, it took 2 of them to carry it. 10 of the 12 spies report, "The land is indeed flowing with milk and honey, but the people are large, the cities are fortified, and we will not be able to defeat them." The Israelites are distraught, immediately saying it would have been better to have just stayed in Egypt. But one of the spies, Caleb, later joined by Joshua, jumps in and tries to calm the crowd by reassuring them that even though the people look tough, with God on their side, nothing was impossible. As hard as Caleb and Joshua tried, the people chose to believe the 10 spies who said that we could not defeat the current inhabitants of the land. This causes them to cry out to God, saying, "If only we had died in Egypt, or if only we might die in the wilderness. Why is Adonai taking us to the land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our children will be carried off. It would be better for us to go back to Egypt." Caleb and Joshua try their best to convince the people that even though they might be outsized, nothing is too hard for them if God is on their side. Pleadingly, they tell the people, if pleased with us, Adonai will bring us into that land, a land that flows with milk and honey, and give it to us. Only you must not rebel against Adonai. Have no fear then of the people of the country, for they are our prey. Their protection has departed from them, but Adonai is with us. Have no fear. In other words, yes, the situation looks dire, but with God, all things are possible. Not only do the people reject this, they actually threaten to pelt Joshua and Caleb with stones if they continue trying to convince them otherwise. This lack of faith so angered God that God once again threatens to destroy the whole community and start anew with Moses. And Moses does what he does each time and intercedes, saying to God, "What would the Egyptians think if you worked so hard to free the people from slavery, only to kill them in the desert?" It works. God relents on the whole destroying us all thing, but instead says that nobody who left Egypt, with the exception of Caleb and Joshua, will set foot in the promised land. Last week, I talked about the fixed mindset of the former slaves. But not only did the former slaves not have the ability to expand their minds to new possibilities and ways of thinking, they were also quick to lose faith and hope. The former slaves were single-minded folks who only believed what they could see and touch. We see this several times from their behavior in Egypt as they are freed from slavery, and again when they are wandering in the desert. We see it at the sea's edge, when even after all the plagues the Israelites have witnessed, as soon as they come upon water, they see it as an insurmountable obstacle and cry out. We see it when the people demand that Aaron make a golden calf, a tangible God. As soon as Moses goes up Mount Sinai and we can no longer see him, he must be gone, and we need a God we can touch. Having been slaves for so long with no reason to hope, they lacked the kind of resilience to withstand disappointment and retain faith that things can get better. Like a child, it was out of sight, out of mind, or in their case, out of sight, out of their reality. If they couldn't see, hear, touch, or smell it, they couldn't believe that it was real. In fact, many scholars argue that the tabernacle that we were instructed to build and carry with us in the desert was simply a way for the Israelites to have a constant, tangible reminder of God's presence. Professor Umberto Cassato writes, "So long as they were encamped in the place, they were conscious of God's nearness. But once they set out on their journey, it seemed to them as though the link had been broken, unless they were in the midst of a tangible symbol of God's presence. It was the function of the tabernacle, literally the dwelling, to serve as that symbol. The tabernacle standing in the midst of the camp and the visible presence of the sanctuary proves to them that just as the glory of Adonai dwelt on Mount Sinai, so too God dwells in their midst as they wander through the desert." This is the purpose of the Bible when it states, "And let them make me a sanctuary, that I will dwell in their midst." Faith is believing in something when we don't have proof. Faith is knowing that there is no way to guarantee an outcome, yet still believing that it will happen. So how do you develop faith? It grows out of consistency and out of love, something that was in short supply during the Egyptian slavery, but was abundant in the desert. So like the growth mindset that the next generation of Israelites were able to develop in the desert, so too was this new generation of Israelites, born into freedom, able to develop their faith. From an early age, they were sustained by manna from the heavens and water from a well that followed Miriam. Both of these things were out of the range of normal nature and were therefore proof that God was with them in the desert. Growing up with these constant reminders of God's presence and protection gave the generation the ability to develop faith. It is only with this faith that they were strong enough to enter into the promised land and face the challenges that awaited them. Without adequate faith, they would turn back at the slightest setback, as their parents demonstrated so many times in the desert. So how do we develop faith? How do we develop faith in a world where there is no manna, there is no Miriam's well, and God's presence isn't as tangible as it might have been in the desert? How do we hold on to a belief that we can accomplish more than we think possible? Similar to the Israelites, it's with consistency and love. As God's partners, it is now our responsibility to be that source of consistency and love for one another, and to allow those closest to us to be our source of consistency and love. By surrounding ourselves with people who constantly and consistently show up and demonstrate their love, we can develop the faith and the courage to face our own challenges and take our own leaps of faith. Shabbat Shalom.